You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 59. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, first code experience, and their first job. We've decided not to have a sponsor for the podcast, and if you want to support the podcast and the kinds of things that I do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at seanw.me/psauthor, including my newest course on building a web app with ASP.NET Core. I'm currently on a road trip covering 25 cities in North America and Europe. I'll be doing live interviews while on the road trip of some of your favorite developers, including Scott Guthrie of Microsoft, Bill Wagner, and Juliak. See hwroadtrip.com for more information on cities and dates. On today's show, we have Todd Miranda. Todd Miranda is a consultant, trainer, and author. He has been developing on various platforms for over 20 years and has been involved in .NET since it was first released in 2000. He has worked on many of the .NET platforms, but focuses primarily on ASP.NET. He is the owner of NxtDimension Solutions and provides consulting and training on the Microsoft stack. Todd has been awarded a Microsoft MVP for the last 7 years. He is co-founder of the Birmingham NET User Group and remains active in the development community. He has recorded hundreds of online training videos on Microsoft development topics, including security, JavaScript, Silverlight, WPF, Expression, and ASP.NET. He is an INETA speaker and regularly presents at user groups, community events, and technical conferences. I think I met Todd at his first MVP summit some years back, and I often see him at the Atlanta Code Camp. And he's always been a great asset to the developer community in the Southeast. Today's podcast was recorded live in front of an audience in Birmingham, Alabama, as part of the Hello World road trip. As you'll hear on today's show, Todd has some really interesting hobbies that are pretty unique for most developers. Let's take a listen. Well, welcome Birmingham. That was a very good round of applause. There are Richard Campbell and Carl Franklin always use the joke of 4,000 or 5,000 people in the audience, so I won't use that joke here. Trying not to steal too much of
that. They're here. It's good.
Yeah, it's a smaller group, but it's an intimate 2,000.
That's right. Yeah,
intimate 2,000. So we're here in Birmingham, Alabama, and we want to hear from our special guest, Todd Miranda, about how he got started. Now, Did you have a computer growing up? Did you have one in the house?
I did, actually. I guess my first computer was the old C64.
Commodore 64.
Oh yes,
a lot of love there.
There was a lot of love there, and except on those days where you had just finished typing in the 478,000th line of binary numbers. And then it crashed or something.
Then it crashed.
Yeah. And you didn't have the tape backup at the time. And when I say tape backup, I literally mean the cassette tape backup. If you didn't have that going, boy, you had to start all over again. So
I really like this idea of tape backup because we've gone far enough in technology that young developers don't know what the tapes were. Right?
That's right.
That cassette, you can't even get cassettes anymore.
I know.
Or have it, you probably have a grandmother who has the place in the car to put them in.
That's right. Yeah. My daughter said not so long ago, she said, well, what is a cassette? And I shook my head. I've done an injustice, I think. So.
Well, yeah, children should grow up with HISS.
That's exactly right. It's important.
It is. So you had this Commodore 64 and you were writing BASIC on it?
Yeah. BASIC is ultimately where I started. Where I really started was prior to the Commodore 64. My father's uncle worked. I still to this day, I really don't know where he worked, but wherever he worked, he had a terminal at his house. And
oh, really?
Sat me down when I was very, very young at the terminal and gave me this book. And the language that the book taught was a basic ease type language. I don't know. I think it was something proprietary to the company that he worked for. And I started going through the book and teaching myself with the book how to program. And that was that was really where I got started. So then obviously the Commodore 64 was the first machine that I physically had of my own.
Nice. And were you writing actual like things that you could use, or were you just playing around with software?
So when he was, when I was sitting at his terminal, it was really just playing around. And what was interesting, and I still remember this to this day, the book was a big book. It was like a
binder,
a big binder. And the way it taught you programming was by making mistakes. So it actually taught you to do things wrong, and then you'd get an error on the screen. And it would say, "Oh, you got this error, and here's why you got this error." And
test-driven development.
Yeah, it was incredible. Yeah. It really, but it gave me a different perspective. And then when I had my Commodore 64, then I was obviously writing real cool, top-notch games and things. I remember writing a little ninja text adventure.
Oh, nice.
Where you were the ninja and you had to go in and defeat enemies. So it was, turn left, turn right,
And you were able to put curse words in when you.
Yeah, I was young enough where I was taught that was not right, so I had to leave those out. But
you must have been raised right. But
it depends on who you ask, I guess. But yeah, I suppose so.
Did you have this like fascination with coding? I mean, was it really about coding, or was it? I know some people grew up with a computer in the house, and it was more like their version of a console, right?
Sure.
That was a way for them to play games and such. And some other people just became fascinated with the puzzle of a computer.
Absolutely. I really loved the coding aspect. I mean, when I was learning to write, when I was learning to code on that terminal, it really was a pivotal moment. It really changed me because the act of creating, the act of using logic and actually being able to write this text and then have things happen was fascinating to me.
Oh, yeah.
And so I continued that. And the idea of creation was something that I really continued along with as well. I like to build things. I like to create things, the Lego, bricks, blocks, all that kind of stuff. Anything that was creative and making things. Yeah. And obviously on the computer, it was great because you were fairly limitless in what you could create because it was all digital. So
absolutely. And that continued through high school?
It did. It was so when I was in elementary school and I guess middle school. In middle school, Commodore came into our school with these big PET. If anybody remembers the old PET computers,
PETs, yeah.
And they wanted to teach a computer programming course. So of course I signed up and very very quickly realized that everything that they were going to show us in their book, I had already learned. So I kind of let my sister take the course instead of me. She was younger than I was. But because of that, the person who brought the computers and handed all that, she asked if I wanted to teach the lab. So I was, 8th grade, fixing to start high school, and I was teaching the lab after school for the Commodore system at school, which was great fun. Great fun. And my first experience in dealing with wrangling cats or kids, as the case may be, but it was great fun to actually teach that. And which is where I also got some of my love of teaching, I think, as well.
So do you think that teaching the kids was harder than teaching adult developers?
At the time, yeah, definitely. It was because, the problem is adults get frustrated for different reasons, but kids' attention span is about the size of a gnat. So, and when you were dealing with a storage system that was, again, going back to the cassette tape that took, 5 minutes to store the 5 lines of code that you had written, that attention span, that didn't work out very well.
No, it really didn't. And did you end up going to college for computers or?
Well, one of my other loves was, I liked building things. One of my other loves was working with electronics.
Oh, nice.
And I took apart a number of electronics when I was younger. And so when I went to school, I was going to be a veterinarian of all things.
Oh, really? Because you're not allowed to take those apart.
You're right. Hopefully you just put all that back together. which I wasn't very good at with the electronics, by the way. But went to an engineering open house and realized that I could combine my love of software and writing code with my love of electronics and the actual hardware piece.
I was so waiting for veterinarian to be in there.
Yeah,
I could build robot pets or something.
Sadly, sadly, those cats and dogs, I didn't ever make it that far. But,
that's good.
Went into electrical engineering and focused on industrial control. So I built a lot of control systems.
Nice. Yeah. And you got your degree in that?
I did, actually. I got my bachelor's in electrical engineering, and then was crazy enough to go back and get my master's, and even contemplated PhD. But by that time, I had matured enough to be smart enough to know that probably wasn't the best choice to go back and go through all that pain to get my PhD.
And debt.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right.
So did you come out of school building these control systems? Was that like your main? I
did, actually. Well, my first job temporarily, while I was looking for, I guess, my first real job, was with Kohler generators, and worked on that side of the house, and then became interestingly enough, worked at a coal mine as an electrical engineer, and that was fascinating and terrifying all at the same time. But did
were
work
you working
as
in the mines, or were you doing control systems above ground?
I was actually, I managed a team of technicians, so we went underground almost every day. Wow! But as an EE, I was really focused on the electrical aspects of the equipment, and the things underground, monitoring systems and everything else. We did some pretty interesting things that I got lucky enough to be involved in. We built the first DC quad drive system for a belt, in North America, and that was kind of a big deal. And we replaced a bunch of other control systems that were fairly critical, which was a little terrifying when you're dealing with when you got people's lives in your hands.
You do.
But it taught me, frankly, from a software perspective, a lot about kind of backup systems, redundancy, watchdogs, a lot of that kind of stuff. Because when you're dealing with human lives, it's a little terrifying, but it makes you think a little differently. So
absolutely, there's nothing as terrifying to me as writing software that people depend on, right, for their life. Or going down in a coal mine elevator.
Yes, well, both of those things are actually pretty scary. So, but it was a great experience. I'm glad I had the experience, but definitely not something that I wanted to do long term. It was an interesting environment.
I did some work for a company that administers radiation for cancer treatment, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to contribute code to any of this. I'm going to help them look at big vision, but I want to be able to sleep at night. And the idea that a buffer overrun is going to over radiate a patient scared the bejesus out of me.
Yeah, it really makes you think differently when you're, and this is something that, so many developers, we write code, but do we really consider what that code is going to be doing? Who's going to be affected by that code? And I think if we, a lot of times if we think like that, it gives us a different perspective, makes us kind of a little more sure of what we're doing, or at least hopefully a little more sure of what we're doing.
So in a lot of ways, you were gathering requirements from the people that it was affecting back then, but it was, sort of on a whole level. It wasn't, do you want to be able to tab through the fields? It was, do you want to come out of the mine today? Right?
That's right.
You want to make it home tonight.
That's right. Do you want that man lift to actually get you all the way to the surface, or all the way down safely? So
absolutely.
Yeah, it was, like I said, very, very unique, gave me a different perspective. And I got that perspective early on, which I think helped me in a lot of the parts of my career beyond that, because that was one of my early jobs. So,
and how did that move from more an EE job to more writing software?
Well, that was so interestingly enough, the girl that I was dating at the time, who is now my wife, I don't even have to pay her anymore. It's wonderful. She actually stays because she wants to.
You still pay her.
Yeah, well, I don't like to admit
now. When people said that before, I had no idea, but now I know.
Now you know. We like to fool ourselves, right?
Yeah. So, no, I don't. I'm not in denial. But
well, she's here, so there's only so much you can get away with.
That's true. That's why she's here.
That's right. That's right. So she was working for a telecom company, and a position opened up as a developer, and that's part of the magic. It's a feature.
I guess it turned off.
So the position opened up as a developer, and my idea of a telecom at the time was not all that great. So I told her, I said, oh, sure, I'll come and interview. I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
But I really, I didn't even wear my coat in. I left it in the car. I was like, I'm just going to go through the motions. And I went and talked to the gentleman about the position, and it actually sounded pretty interesting. And afterwards I was like, wow, I wish I had cared a little more about that. But wound up, they called me back, and it was an interesting change because it took me back to my original love, which was software, which was the software side. So, and I still dabble to this day. I still dabble with right now sitting at my desk at home. I've got a Raspberry Pi sitting there that I've been playing with. So I still dabble on the hardware side and the robotics and a lot of that kind of stuff that I used to enjoy. But software was where it all started for me. And it's kind of where I've returned.
And how were you able to take some of those lessons you learned in EE, especially with, sort of the high stakes EE you were doing, and how did that affect the way you wrote software? Well,
there was some interesting opportunities. Not only from the EE side, do you really in school, you don't really learn a lot of what you're going to use every day.
Right.
Now in EE, I actually used more of that than I thought I would, but you learn the logic. You learn that the ability to think through problems and solve problems. And that as a software developer is what we do every day. So it helped me in my debugging skills. It helped me in my ability to just look at a problem and solve that problem. The things that one of my big pet peeves now is I think the younger generation, we have so many abstractions in our software languages now that there's so much that gets glossed over. Yeah. That back, I say in the early days, it makes me sound like I'm so old, but back in the early days, thanks. I appreciate that. We ignore the little gray hair there. We had to care about that stuff. We had to care about memory. We had to care about, efficiency. And we don't have to care about that as much now. And I think we lose something from it. So that came forward, from my days in electrical engineering. Yeah. And then specifically in that first job as an electrical engineer, one of the things that I wound up being a part of was was writing a GUI for a SCADA system. So we were monitoring. So it's we were monitoring all the underground equipment. In a GUI, we wanted to be able to see that a belt was running or not running, or that the temperature on a particular unit was too high or just in the right range. Right. So we were using Modula 2 to build it, but I was using straight Windows SDK. Oh, nice. Which was beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. So I get in there, and as I'm writing the UI, one of the things that I remember so vividly is just wanting to create the rubber band so that I could drag and select the number of items on the screen. So I'm looking for the SDK call, right? The API call to build the rubber band. It's like, well, no, you don't do that. You have to actually draw the rubber band on the screen. So, I learned more about the Windows operating system on that project that I carried with me for many, many years after that. When there was a problem, I had some better insight into what's going on in the operating system. So it really helped me debug and work through problems in my code. Yeah. And that was a tremendous experience that really kind of carried forward. And I used quite a bit for years after that. That's interesting, because I found when I was teaching development, especially sort of beginning development, there are some concepts around just sort of the structure of base 2 memory that comes up in memory managed languages all the time. Sure. But because you don't have that basis of, really, my objects are really going to be laid out in these sections, that it doesn't matter. And if you've never had to sit there and actually do the binary math or to understand how ORs are going to work between different values and those, because that's just the way you've done it, because you can avoid it if you search on Stack Overflow long enough. You'll find someone that can sort of copy and paste it down. And, and it'll work until it doesn't. And the problem is, how do you know really what's wrong with it? Because you really don't know what it was doing in the first place. Yeah, absolutely. There's supposedly an add-in in Visual Studio that when errors happen, they will give you a link to a Stack Overflow search for it. Nice. And that scares the... Nice. I love Stack Overflow. I really do. It's huge, but we need to think through problems before we go there, as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's a little easy to... And think through problems after we go there. One of the things that I tell a lot of the developers, I copied this off of Stack Overflow. I was like, okay, but did you look at it? Did you look at what you were copying? Did it make sense? Because just because it's on the internet surprisingly enough, doesn't mean that it's actually correct or true.
Or qualifies for what you're trying to apply it to.
That's
right?
exactly right.
That's always the case. So as you started working in this new, you were working at the telecom writing software.
Right.
And was that using the SDK as well, or was that kind of post SDK work?
No, that was post SDK. That was well, actually, interestingly enough, we started out with some Cold Fusion there.
Oh wow!
And that was
you're the one.
I was the one of the three. And there was another one of the three here in Birmingham as well. We started Cold Fusion User Group here.
Oh really?
Back in the day.
Wow.
Had one of the larger, surprisingly now, this is Birmingham, but had one of the larger Cold Fusion User Groups.
Wow.
I actually talked with Jeremy Allaire on a number of occasions, and this was back in the day when they were doing a lot of promo stuff. So we got all kinds of giveaways, and it was a pretty big group. So we did Cold Fusion for a while, and then moved into the .NET world a little bit. So that was fun.
Yeah, that's an interesting transition. So did you when you were working with you said Modula 2 against the SD?
Right.
Did you do you think that sort of experience understanding what's happening underneath the covers? I assume you had to go down to writing your own message pump and all that.
Absolutely. And what was interesting is if you've ever written, well, I mean, this happens in C and C++ as well. Yeah. If you're paying attention, you're seeing a lot of the messages that come in from the operating system.
Yeah.
And if you don't filter that and you actually watch them all, it's just constant flow of messaging. There's tons of messaging that's going on there.
Yeah.
So being introduced to that concept, the idea that the operating system is constantly sending out all these messages for everything that's going on, not only user interaction, but system level stuff that's going on in Windows. And then you simply say, yeah, I'm interested in that. Yeah. So let me know anytime that happens and I'll respond to it. That's an interesting concept that has been abstracted away a lot now, but we still see it a lot. I mean, pub sub models, and
absolutely.
A lot of those models, they work the same way. So some of that foundation carried forward in so much of what we see today. And again, it helped me as you have problems with your software, you can rely on the knowledge that you picked up in the operating system and say, oh, you know what? I bet this is what's going on there. Yeah. It gave me a little bit more insight, which was
great. Be able to get around the framework you're using. This happens a lot in WinForms, where I know that WinForms says it's not available, but it is in Windows, so we can ultimately get around.
That's right.
That's right. Whatever the little weird peculiarity, and you really want a clock up in the toolbar, I'll get you a clock.
Sure, we can do that.
Yeah. It's very. The first time I saw that sort of message pump with all the Windows messages, the first thing I thought was, this is the most insecure sort of thing. Everyone's getting their messages. Right. It's not, the top level window is the desktop. Sure. Wow. That I found that very, I could hijack other apps and all sorts of weird hooks.
I mean, sometimes it's terrifying.
It's a lot of power.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes. But with that power, you're like, I can really do anything.
Yeah.
Anything that you really want to do.
You could. There's been very interesting projects there. As you matured as a software developer, were you working initially alone, or were you immediately thrown into teams?
So initially, I would say most of the work was alone. Mm-hmm. I could say team from the perspective of a lot of times you had to go get external resources.
Sure.
And you had to work with external teams and external people. But most of the work that I was doing initially was alone. So the team aspect, I don't think really came in, frankly, till probably from a software perspective, till I was at Telcom. That's probably fairly accurate. And then I actually came into Telcom and moved up to kind of a lead type role in the Telcom. So I worked with the team and then kind of was lead with the team, which is quickly gave me another aspect to the team concept. So.
And what do you think you learned about working in a team at the Telecom? What are because I find those first jobs, especially when you start working in groups, dealing with other people, very they're lessons that you stay with you the rest of your.
Absolutely. I think dealing with people in general is difficult to do, and there's a lot to learn there about how to deal with people and the interactions. And what makes one person tick may not necessarily make another person tick. And so not only are you looking at ideally, how can I work with person A to be more efficient and work with person B to be more efficient when A and B may work very differently. You know?
Right.
So I think that was a big lesson with the team. And I was lucky because I think a lot of times the first time you're introduced to a team, if this is something if software is something you're passionate about, one of the things that in my opinion, I think we see a lot is developers go through a maturity life cycle. And they start off, a lot of times a developer will start off in an organization and they're the only developer. And everyone thinks that they're absolutely wonderful and they can do everything. And they begin to feel like they can do everything. And sometimes that progresses. And these are the developers that you see periodically, the young, not to stereotype, but some of the younger developers that come into an organization and feel like they know it all.
Yeah.
And hopefully those developers meet someone who kind of knocks them down a couple notches, gives them some sense of humility, and makes them realize that, you know what, your whole rest of your life is all about learning and constantly growing. So I was lucky enough to have met some very influential, great leaders as I was growing up and working in EE. And so I kind of had already been smacked down a little bit and been given some sense of where I really fit in. So luckily, when I got in the team environment, one of the things I didn't have to face was this idea of, well, I know what I'm doing and you people are all crazy.
Right.
Granted, I still think that sometimes, but that's a whole different thing.
Sometimes,
well, most. So, for me, it was getting to know the team and the people that I'm working with and sharing ideas and really finally having an environment where you could get various opinions on how to do something and then come up with the right solution through conflict.
Yeah.
And learning that conflict wasn't bad. Conflict used the right way actually leads to better outcomes.
Right.
And that was another lesson that, again, since I was able to learn that a little earlier, I really think it paid off in the long run in my career.
Did you learn that you had users in college, or was that really the sort of formulation and the EE work and then ultimately? Sure,
I did, because one of the things that I did in college, I was lucky enough, I actually worked at the ticket office at the college that I went to.
Oh.
And at the time, when I started working at the ticket office, we did our books still on ledger sheets. And I remember my boss and I, oh man, it was great. My boss and I were so both very OCD and anal that we would, at the end of the month, we would work until we found that penny.
Yeah.
I mean, it had to match, And because of all that, I thought, you know what, we can automate a lot of this.
Sure.
So I wrote a proposal when I was in college and submitted it to the part of the college, the division that I was in, and got approval to get a computer, buy the equipment to hook our register up to the computer so we could download the transactions for the day. And then I worked with Quark spreadsheet.
Quark Express.
Quark Express, and built a system to do our books for us. So while I was there, we slowly transitioned to an automated system to do our books.
Wow.
That I was very proud of. That was one of my first, it was terrifying to write a proposal like that. And I didn't know what I was doing and learned a lot there. But as a result of that, I had kind of worked in that way where I was working with others. And so I got a lot of that there. And that was lucky, as well.
So when you started to be a lead, how did you figure out how to mentor other people? I mean, because to me, a lead is much different than a manager. It is. I agree. And, when I said that my experience with doing the labs, even when I was very young, that engendered in me this love of teaching. Mm-hmm. And I was also, another piece that's not related to software, I'm a professional magician as well. So I think you know from the past. Yeah. So I had spent many opportunities teaching others magic. So I loved this idea of teaching. So to me, mentoring was just another form of teaching. Sure.
So I thrived on that. It was great to be able to share my experiences, good and bad, with others in an effort to keep them from having to make the same mistakes I made over and over again. So mentoring to me was just really triggered my love of teaching. And I fell right into it pretty naturally.
Did you also find that improve the quality of the work you were doing? Because that had to be the exemplar for the people that you were mentoring.
Oh, absolutely. Number one, it makes you a lot more sensitive to what it is you're doing.
Sure.
I think we as software developers anyway, and maybe it's insecurity, but we're all very, very cautious. We don't want anybody to see our code, right?
Right.
I don't want anybody to see this. I'm not done with this yet. 3 months later, it's like, oh, that's terrible. What was I thinking?
Yeah.
So it does make you a little bit more self-aware of what it is you're doing, because some people are going to be looking at your code. But, if you realize early on that everybody has stuff to learn, then it's not going to be perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. And it's quite possible that someone much junior than I am is going to look at what I've done and come up with another idea, just because maybe they could, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
As long as you're open to that, then it takes a little bit of that stress away, because if somebody criticizes it, great. Do you have a better option? Share it. Maybe I can learn from that as well.
Yeah.
So
that makes a lot of sense. So another skill of yours that I'm fascinated with, because I have no ability, is your ability to make these fondant cakes and stuff.
Oh, sure.
And how is that related, so I can shoehorn it into the conversation?
Wow. How do you make the correlation between those two? Well, so here's an interesting thing. I mentioned before that whole creativity and building things.
Absolutely.
And making things.
Yeah.
It's funny when you look at software developers, and I think technical people in general. How many technical people do you know play a musical instrument?
Yeah, a lot.
It's this creative side of our nature. And so I worked at a Baskin Robbins when I was a teenager, and the manager taught me how to ice and decorate the cakes. So I loved it. Because I was creating, I was drawing, I was, it was making stuff, and that just carried over. And I learned more and more over the years about decorating cakes and everything else. So I'm no cake boss, that's for sure, but it's something that I enjoy. It's a creative outlet for me. That's beside the software. So.
Interesting. And do you find that having that sort of non-digital break is important to what you do? Absolutely.
I think software development and a lot of technical, engineering, a lot of this kind of stuff, it's a good way to drive yourself insane.
Yeah.
Because we tend to focus on the details. So we are down in the details a lot. And I think if you can't allow yourself to come up from that sometimes and take a deep breath, then you get to a point where your focus becomes too narrow.
Right.
And you lose sight of some things. Mm-hmm. So I have a lot of hobbies. A lot of people laugh at the number of hobbies that I have, but it gives me these constant breaks away from that intensity of software development and architecture and design.
Because it really can be incredibly intense.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And the project you're working on now, you're doing a lot more management than coding. And because you're an architect on this large, I don't know whether you can talk about it, but
yeah. So we're doing a combined eligibility and enrollment system for the state of Alabama.
Oh, nice.
And it's a huge project. We're doing a lot of things very different for a state project. We're doing Scrum. We've built an organization internally instead of using a third party large organization like a Deloitte or an Accenture.
All right.
So we've built the organization ourselves to do that. A lot of what we're doing is very, very different model from what a lot of the more innovative companies are doing some of the stuff that we're doing. But for our state project, what we're doing is really out there. So using Scrum, focusing on mastery of our staff, focusing on autonomy, allowing them to drive how they approach certain things and what they do and everything else. It's changed the way that you work as a manager, because we're less manager as we are advisors. And it's an interesting model. We've had some challenges that we've worked through, but the team has responded very well, and we're doing some great things now. The team is really making a lot of really interesting progress. We were talking earlier. One of the things that just recently happened in the team, without going into a lot of detail, is one of our development teams recently voted off a member of the development team. The person wasn't working out. They weren't pulling their weight. And they have the power, they have the autonomy to come to the leadership and say, we've tried to work with this person and it's not working out. So we would prefer them not be part of the team.
Right.
And we made that change. And so there's a lot of really interesting things that we're doing on the management side of the project. And that's another love. It's really still problem solving.
Sure.
You're just instead of writing code and figure out problems in code, you're figuring out problems with developers.
Right, with the organization. And this is sort of a personal, might be a little personal, but it affects me in that I feel like I haven't ever really gotten away from the code as much as I thought I should.
Sure.
Right. And since you're helping manage this project so much, how do you make that transition from watching other people code and is it ever going to be good enough? Right. There's this notion in my head that it feels like a learning opportunity for me to see in a project the way someone's tackled something as being different than the way I would have approached it. That doesn't mean it's worse or better.
Correct.
And certainly not wrong. And how do you let go of that? And did you go through that?
I did go through that. As a matter of fact, luckily I had gone through that before this project.
Oh, nice.
Another company that I had worked in where I was the development manager. I went in with this idea that I was going to be a functional manager and I was going to actually be doing work as well as managing the team.
Oh, right.
And I failed.
Wow.
Now, I mean, it didn't fail miserably, but I was failing. I found that I became a roadblock to the team because in an effort to quote unquote help the team, I would say, hey, you know what? I'll take that and I'll do that. And then you never enough time. I mean, if you're managing, you're not going to have time to do that. So I learned very quickly that it's just, in my opinion, it's not feasible to succeed trying to do both. So you have to learn to step away and interject yourself where it's necessary, but stop yourself from getting too deep.
Right.
Give that advice, give the opinions, and let the team run with that. So it's been very, very useful in this project because some of our leadership are still going through that right now in this project.
Sure.
They're learning that now, some of the lessons that I had learned before.
And that's not an easy lesson to tell them, hey, I've been through it before.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, it's just like a parent saying, you know what, trust me, one of these days you'll understand.
Yeah.
And it is very difficult. And that to me, and I've told a number of people, the transition from developer to manager is an incredibly difficult transition. Yeah. If you care about the development, it's really hard to let go. And the key for me, I think, is don't let go. Don't ever let go. Continue to learn, continue to, on nights and weekends, this is my hobby as well as my job. So I'm constantly staying up on the latest stuff. I'm constantly fiddling. I'm writing stuff. Just last week, as a matter of fact, I put together a little app for us to do a trivia game at one of our all hands meetings at work. Nice. And it works with I used Twilio, and it works with the text. So everybody has a phone. Yeah. So I was like, what we're going to do is we're going to show some questions up on the screen and you can actually text your answer. And then I'm using, so it runs in Azure. I'm using SignalR to push real-time ranking results to the website. So it's a POC to kind of demonstrate some interesting concepts. But I threw something like that together in some of my spare time. And so I keep my kind of my whistle wet, in the software. I don't ever really let it go. But at work, I'm able to draw that line and say, when I'm here, this is where I need to focus and this is what I need to be doing to help the team. And later on, I can work on some of this other stuff to make me happy. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm rewriting my blog yet again because Microsoft has released something new. Yeah. And there might be a better way. Sure. Since I know everyone else has now moved to some blog engine. Oh, yeah. And my wife listening to me curse, I'm trying to watch Friends. Can you just not curse for a few minutes? Hasn't been working. You need to get the priorities straight, right? Yeah. Ross and Rachel are not going to get together without us. That's right. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. This has been really great, and I think very insightful. Thanks for having me. It's been fun to kind of relive some of those memories. It was nice to think back on some of that stuff again. It's been a while. Some of them are so far, a long time ago. That's true. I'm surprised you can remember them. That's true. Well, you know what? It's my short-term memory's gone. Long-term, that was great. So that's great. Anything that happened more than 10 years ago, I can remember. But, that's awesome. Yeah. So tomorrow I won't remember who you are, Sean. So that's okay. Yeah. That's what we're hoping, actually. Well, everyone, can we give Todd a great big hand for being on the show?
Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Hello World podcast at